Hello, my name is Gurpreet Dhillon, and I'm a professor of information security at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. Today, the focus of our discussion is cybersecurity culture and how it impacts the strategy formulation and implementation, particularly information security strategy formulation and implementation. The word culture is often a confused and a widely used, very loosely used term. Traditionally, it has always been associated with personal growth. Even if you rejected an establishment, people would have a counterculture. In the 80s and the 90s, it was a source of pride. A multicultural ethos was prevalent. Today, however, culture is often considered in a shady, ridiculous manner, and we often do not necessarily want to ascribe to any kind of a cultural setting. But often organizations do promote that they have a culture of transparency or perhaps a culture of accountability. Today, establishing some kind of a cybersecurity culture is equally important because what is very, very important for us in enterprises is to have a common understanding of how we are going to be protecting the information resources of a firm largely because of the interconnectedness of the world and our interdependence on computers and information communication technologies. It becomes very important for people to have a common understanding as to how they are going to think in terms of security, how they are going to have a common understanding of the processes that are involved, and so on and so forth. Hence, cybersecurity culture becomes a very important aspect, particularly if you're thinking of formulating any kind of a security policy. And more so, the implementation of the security policy is very, very important because that is to a large extent dependent on the culture. We can create wonderful policies, but they have to be institutionalized in enterprises. The whole process of institutionalization is only going to succeed if we have a wonderful and a good common understanding of the normative structures that an organization has and the structures that the new security policy may be trying to implement. So having a common understanding becomes very, very important. The first and obvious thing that arises is what do we mean by culture? It is rather difficult to define culture from a singular perspective. It is a multifaceted construct which has multiple attributes that come together to define what culture might be. Um, it could be inspiring surroundings within which you operate. It could be a collective vision and purpose that we have in a given enterprise. It could be visible and an inspiring leadership that exists in an organization that defines what culture is. It could be effective, positive management that an enterprise might have that defines a certain kind of a culture. If my employees are empowered to take decisions on their own, i.e., meaning empowered decision making, that is a culture. Empowerment is a culture in that case. The team dynamics that exist in an organization that defines the prevalent culture of an enterprise. If a given enterprise is easy and has a flexible work environment, that in itself is a kind of a cultural attribute. How day-to-day communication takes place also defines culture. If all you're receiving is emails from the top leadership, then that certainly gives a certain kind of a message as to how an enterprise is operating. If it is the leadership of the organization is coming and walking and talking to the employees, that implies certain aspects that are important for that particular enterprise. I'm always reminded of Peter Drucker, the great management guru, who always talked about effective communication. And one of the things he talks about in one of his earlier books is about managing by walking around, because he always used to feel that if you're doing that, then the leadership of an enterprise is very close to the employees. Hence, really what it means is that leadership aspires to be working with the employees to promote a more collaborative culture, more access to the top leadership. Now, clearly, that is a certain kind of a culture. So, culture has multiple manifestations and has multiple attributes. There's no one way of defining it. Matter of fact, you can't walk into an organization, an enterprise, and say, you know what, this is the culture of the enterprise. No, I mean, it's all a function of interpreting the silent messages that exist in an enterprise and saying that, you know what, I kind of understand what the culture might be because the culture to a large extent is embedded in those silent messages. Talking of silent messages, I'm always reminded of this wonderful book which was done in the 1950s, late 1950s, by an American anthropologist, Edward T. Hall. He wrote this book called The Silent Languages, and it has become one of my favorite readings over the years. Essentially, he shows how factors influence individuals behind the actions that they take, and he talks about how we should be thinking in terms of understanding the silent languages, silent messages that emanate in day-to-day speak. I have personally been greatly influenced by this work and have used it extensively in my writings. Matter of fact, I did a book in 1997, Managing Information System Security. It's a Macmillan publication, and this is perhaps one of the early documented pieces where the term security culture is formally introduced into the literature. And I go at length describing what culture is and how culture should be interpreted and what the importance of cybersecurity culture is. It is not just simply talking about the different attributes that exist in our study of culture, but more importantly, how are we going to be measuring those elements, because culture evolves as we go along, and it becomes very, very important for us to assess at periodically as to where we are and where we aspire to be. Now, commonly speaking, when we talk to people, they say you really can't change culture, or it takes a long, long time to change culture. Yes, of course, it does take a long time to change culture, but from a security perspective, it's very, very important for us to have an ability so that we can judge where you are today and where you're going to be at a certain point in time. Technology changes, organizational processes change. There's a lot of turnover, and particularly in the technology field, people move, and culture kind of tends to evolve as a result. Hence, it becomes very, very important for us to have measures, to have mechanisms of assessing our competence of the people, the kind of value systems they have, the normative structures that they create around themselves. And as we go along in this particular video, you will see how I have devised certain mechanisms for assessing cybersecurity culture in a here and now situation and in the future. We can think of culture in different ways, and one particular aspect that needs to be thought about is compliance. And in terms of security, it is security compliance. Now, traditionally, whenever we talk about compliance, we are essentially talking about rule-based compliance. Essentially, if you have some kind of an organization governance structure, what kind of a regulatory compliance can we bring into place such that we are complying with a given security policy? Generally speaking, such like compliance is incentive based. It's exemplars of good behavior or bad behavior. If you are not complying to something, then we are going to reprimand you. And if you're complying with something, we are probably going to reward you. So reward and punishment takes the form of regulatory compliance. So we are essentially forcing individuals to do the right thing or whatever we have prescribed in a given regulatory framework. There's an alternative way of thinking about compliance, and that is more of societal governance structures and normative controls that we need to bring in place. I like calling that ideals-based compliance. When you have ideals-based compliance, you really cannot force rules, but you are essentially establishing a good normative structure, and that normative structure is culturally driven. In my belief that when you have a normatively driven set of controls, those are more robust and they sustain themselves over a longer period of time. So compliance really is an interesting way to look at a security culture as well. And if we have good normatively based controls, then you're perhaps going to have good behavior, good security related behavior in the end. Now, it goes without saying that you cannot substitute one with the other. Clearly, in any given situation, you do need to have regulatory compliance in concert with ideals based compliance, and those two need to inform each other. But in terms of security culture, the importance of normative controls and normative ideals based compliance becomes more important. So it is our endeavor at all times that we inculcate an environment where normative controls are prevalent. We are able to establish those normative controls. We are able to assess them over a period of time. If there are any changes, we are able to proactively rectify them. And there are several examples in the industry where inability to understand the normative structures have caused dramatic breaches. One of my favorite breaches, which I always like talking about, is that of Bearing Spank and Nick Leeson. This is way back 20 years ago, when Nick Leeson was able to subvert the controls, existing rule-based controls in a subsidiary of Bearing Spank in Singapore, and able to play around with the front and back end of the systems, and hence this 200 and plus year old bank went bust. And it was all because it's not just the regulatory compliance that was at stake, but it was the normative structure that existed in the subsidiary unit which caused this kind of a breach to take place. And there are several other cases in point as well, where a right balance between regulatory compliance aspects and ideas-based compliance has not been established, which causes different kinds of security problems in enterprise. One of the reasons why regulatory compliance on its own does not necessarily work all the time is because of the very human nature, because of the way people think and the stuff. I would like to give an example of TSA in the US. Now, we all know, those of you who are frequent flyers, that TSA has a list of prohibited items that you cannot take on board. But yet, occasionally, you will see people who come up with these funny, interesting ways of smuggling things onto the aircraft. And here is a graphic of one individual who tried to take pigeons on board, and thinking that if these are stuffed into his trousers or track pants, nobody's going to be able to see them. Now, this is clearly an example of trying to subvert the regulatory compliance, because if you look into the prohibited item list from TSA, obviously pigeons do not fall into that category, but clearly there are other rules which forbid you from taking live animals on board. The point is that it is more of an appreciation of security. It's an appreciation of what the rules are and how you are going to sustain them over a period of time. That aspect is very, very important. Now, only if we understand that security is important for all of us, and we need to respect those rules and structures that exist, then obviously there's going to be better compliance. Now, that cannot just come from reward and punishment aspects of regulatory compliance. That always comes from ideals-based normative control structures. The important question that arises is, how do we assess this normative culture? How do we assess human activities and see how they're going to be changing over a period of time? And I would like to spend a little bit of our time over the next few slides talking about assessment of human activities and the work that we have been doing in this. A lot of the work that we've done in the human activity aspect of security culture is drawn from the original work of Edward T. Hall, the book that I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, The Silent Languages. Hall goes at length to describe different silent messages that emerge in any given situation. He classifies human activities into formal activities, informal, and technical. Clearly, it is beyond the scope of this particular presentation to go to all the details of Edward T. Hall, and I strongly encourage you, if those of you who are interested in knowing more about culture and silent messages, to actually read the Edward T. Hall book from the late 1950s. But what he does is also identify different streams of messages, silent messages that any given situation emanates. And these would be things like how people interact with each other, what the organizational aspects are, how the economic or the business aspects work, what gender issues, what role gender issues have to play, issues about territoriality, temporality, and so on and so forth. What role does play and recreation have in interaction? How do you exploit given interactions for your advantage? And all these interact with each other. So in a bigger scheme of things, Edward T. Hall is actually proposing a 10 by 10 matrix where each of his 10 cultural streams interact with the other 10 cultural streams to produce perhaps 100 different cultural settings. Now, clearly, it's very difficult in any kind of a situation to understand all the 100 situations, and particularly if we have to come up with some kind of an assessment tool. So what we did was we kind of looked at Edward T. Hall's work, and we kind of modified his theoretical understanding of how security culture or culture has to be understood, and we kind of modified it to apply to security culture. So we took his 10 cultural streams all the way from interaction, organization, economic aspects, gender, territoriality, temporality, association, and so on and so forth. And we started looking at the human activities. How do these streams link with the human activities that he identified, which is the formal, informal, and the technical? And then for each one of them, we came up with an assessment mechanism for to understand how a given team, a given organization, a given instance was performing. For example, if you look into the interaction of formal and the interaction aspects of individuals, here we identify the tone that is used in the communications, which affects our understanding of information security. At another situation, we might look into superior-subordinate relationships and how certain security rules are being understood and interpreted, and so on and so forth. Again, in certain cases, money may be a motivator. In other cases, learning and temporality issues may be very, very important. And when I talk about temporality, I'm always reminded of this movie, Office Space, where it was just largely because of temporality issues and territoriality issues that the company ended up getting burnt. Literally speaking, one of the employees goes and burns the whole office down to ashes because his space was being intruded upon. So those things are very, very real. I mean, although this is fictional, it's a movie, but those things are very, very real. Territoriality aspects have a very important role to play as far as creating or not creating disgruntled employees in an institution and an enterprise. So these things are very, very important in a sense, but we've kind of looked into the 10 cultural streams of Edward T. Hall, and we have linked them with the human activities of formal, informal, and technical activities that they engage in on a daily basis. And we come up with 30 different options that help us to create a heat map of a sort, and then we have a questionnaire that goes with each of those items to assess what the current situation is. Now, it's very interesting to see that you can actually use this tool, and we have done that in experimental mode, and now we are kind of taking this into a live mode, working with different enterprises. But in the experimental mode, we introduced a security breach in an experimental setting, and we kind of assessed the culture that existed for a group prior to the breach being introduced and post-breach. And clearly, as you can see in the graphic, we were able to see why certain things change, some cultural settings change, some human activities change, and how they impact the 10 cultural streams of Edward T. Hall. So it's an interesting way to assess where you are and where you are going. This is clearly one way of looking at culture. There are multiple other facets of culture which need to be looked at, particularly in terms of cybersecurity culture. We've done a fair amount of work, as is evident from the references that you see here on the screen right now. But this is something that is important for institutions today, particularly because the diverse nature of organizations. We are no longer an enterprise which is located in a certain geographic region. We are much more flatter. We are spread across. We are virtual. We dial in. We are more of a amorphous mass rather than a hierarchical institution of the past. So in these kind of situations, building some kind of a security culture to sustain or information protection behaviors becomes very, very important. And that is really the focus of this particular presentation, that we need to be appreciative of what is going on around us and build some kind of an ideals-based compliance structure, whatever works, and you can modify these things. But as long as the awareness exists that we need to be thinking in terms of security culture, I believe strongly that these are steps in the right direction, because that's what's going to help us build a secure and a robust enterprise. Thank you very much.